Welcome to Here's the Thing. My name is Vince Negro, and with us on today's program is Patrick Morrison. Patrick, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
You know, you've got a huge resume and community organizer, political activist. Before we get into all that, I always like to ask the question, who was Patrick in high school?
Right. Funnily enough, by the end of high school, Patrick in high school looked somewhat like he does now. I had long hair and some facial hair and was a bit of a rabble-rouser, but at the same time, a good guy. I love playing soccer, and I was active in organizing kids to do interesting projects.
What school did you go to?
I was very lucky and fortunate. Growing up in Toronto, you know, the diversity that you can encounter, I was educated in the French language because when I was very young, they opened a public French language school in downtown Toronto, and there weren't enough Francophone kids to fill the kindergarten.
The kindergarten.
So I had to go through some kind of tests. I pulled the wool over their eyes and snuck in, and so École Publique Gabriel Roy, I was educated there, and then by the time high school came around, they hadn't put a proper high school in downtown Toronto yet, but Jarvis Collegiate hosted a little, you know, separate French high school, so I went to high school there.
So you were at Jarvis Collegiate?
I was, but it was la module de la langue française à l'Institut collégial de Jarvis.
Yeah. I went to Harvard Collegiate, and there was always a big rivalry between Jarvis Collegiate and Harvard Collegiate, especially in basketball and stuff like that. And so growing up in the neighborhood generally, and I know there's a relationship with Kensington Market. Did you frequent Kensington Market back in the day in that area?
Not as much as you'd think, a guy like me who spent his whole adult life working and living there. But I did go occasionally to shops like Courage My Love, you know, vintage things. I remember starting a job in Kensington Market. I remember going to Courage My Love to get some nice white shirts and you know, a few ties and you know, start bartending. Yeah.
Same with me. Every time you needed something special with a white shirt or construction socks or sneakers, whatever, Kensington was all the go-to place.
For sure.
And the action, especially on a Saturday morning, afternoon, was like over the top. It's great now as well. We'll talk about that. But always the different trends. It just seems that Kensington Market, even though it went through its phases, always seemed to keep its kind of core, vibrant, trendy, forward-thinking kind of group.
Yeah, a little bit of, it's almost like also the capital of counterculture in Toronto as well. I like to say that we're very tolerant of a lot of things, and the only thing we're intolerant of is intolerance in the neighborhood, you know?
So you became a political, you worked in the political scene and you became a bit of an activist. How did you get involved in that? Was that something that evolved for you? Was it a family members
I grew up with you know, grandparents who were, my mother's father was an MP in Ottawa for a rural area just outside Toronto. But my father's father was at the top of the business world in the time of the Second World War, but left that and became a minister in the United Church of Canada. Both my parents have done advocacy and running charitable foundations. So I have a history of, you know, community or public service in my blood, I guess. My brother's a firefighter, so he's doing something, you know, similar in another way. But I remember, you know, when I left high school, we talked about that. In my first year of university, I was, you know, more active in organizing certain protests around logging at Temagami than I was in going to classes and things. So it's always been part of who I am.
Was it always in the GTA area? Did you expand your horizons?
Well, I've traveled a lot, but really I've lived in Toronto essentially my whole life, and I moved to Kensington, or actually I started working in Kensington in the late 80s at Café Le Gaffe, where Tibet Cafe and Bar is now. And what a great spot that was, what a wonderful crew of people I work with. In addition to that, I had an amazing clients, like the people, the rock stars who were on Much Music, and Daniel Richler, and authors, and all these people were my regulars there, and that sort of, that scene sucked me into the
What year was
Kensington
that? What
vortex.
year was that?
This was in the late 80s.
Late 80s.
They were starting to have some trouble with some behavior, of some people, and because as I told you, how was I in high school? I had long hair, some facial hair. I kind of looked tough, but I could speak French. I knew my wines, so I was a great fit for them. And from the outside, there on Kensington Avenue, you can see the bar, from the street. And I said to them after 2 or 3 weekends, there's no problems here, because I was working. They hired me for Friday and Saturday nights, and they just said not anymore.
But just a comparison, in the late 70s, early 80s, like Yorkville, 70s Yorkville had that kind of vibe before it became Yorkville. There was like a lot of actors and writers. The Minor Bird. The coffee shops. The Minor Bird. Had the topless. It was always kind of. Do you think that Kensington had its distinct image, or was it a bit of a trade-off between Yorkville and Kensington?
You speaking of the 70s and 80s?
Yes.
Well, I'm not a total authority on 70s and 80s, but I would say at Kensington, as always, more. There's this unique thing that happened there. If we can go back in time, and it was originally populated by Scottish laborers who were brought in to build Toronto, and they the Irish were pouring in. And no one would take the Irish in, and there was discrimination, no Irish allowed, things like that. Well, these Scottish laborers let come and live with us, and that sense of welcoming and acceptance which has kind of become a great Canadian value, But that was something that I'm sure originated in other places as well, but it certainly happened in Kensington.
Right.
And so what I'm getting at is, in the 70s and 80s, you had this continuing strong immigrant experience of people arriving to Canada and starting their Canadian dream. I mean, it's probably, from a Portuguese perspective, that would have happened more in the 50s and 60s and maybe 70s, but there was a strong presence of them in Kensington then. But by the 70s and 80s, you're looking at Jamaicans coming in and opening businesses, and
the Jewish community was very prevalent there at one time.
The Jewish community, totally, yeah. Now it was, the Irish came in, but then the Jews came in, and the Jewish population, and it was a time when they were rolling in. It was a time of recession and depression. They were the ones who kind of turned it into a market as opposed to just a residential neighborhood. So opening up the front of the house to whatever kind of business they were doing.